Welcome and thank you for joining us today. In this presentation, we will explore how transdisciplinary curricula have become central to the Urban Design Studio and how this shift invites us to rethink both disciplinary ownership and our core pedagogical practices. We will be asking, what happens when we loosen boundaries between disciplines? How does this transform the design studio? And what possibilities does it open for learners, educators, and cities? We would like to begin by acknowledging the Bidjigal and Gadigal peoples, the custodians of the lands where our campuses reside. We honour their unique values and continuing cultures. To open, we want to briefly situate this work and the team behind it. We are a transdisciplinary team with over 60 years of combined experience teaching urban design and urban design studios at the University of New South Wales across architecture planning, design, and educational science. This presentation comes from Theme 1 of a larger research project, a thematic literature review that maps the many ways urban design studio curricula are defined in higher education. It forms part of my Doctor of Higher Education thesis at UNSW titled Urban Design Studio, Where to From Here? A phenomenographic practitioner-based exploration of factors influencing transdisciplinary urban design studio curricula. The study examines how educators in English language universities understand urban design studio, their experiences, and how recent changes are reshaping practice, particularly the impacts of COVID-19 and emerging technologies like generative AI. Urban design curricula is contested and fragmented. It often sits uneasily between architecture, landscape architecture, and planning, and now without a clear sense of who owns it. The question we want to open with is simple but provocative. Who owns urban design education? And what happens to our students and our cities when that ownership is unclear? How can we teach urban design if we are unsure which branch of the built environment it belongs to? This is a central question we want you to keep in mind. If we cannot clearly locate urban design within architecture, landscape architecture, or planning, or elsewhere, how can we be confident that our teaching structures are appropriate? A related question follows from this. If the ownership of urban design is contested, how can we be certain that the current methods of teaching urban design are indeed the correct ones? Together, these three questions frame the entire presentation and set up the problem of disciplinary ownership of urban design. This persistent tension over the ownership of urban design spills over into the manner in which each discipline imposes its own biases and interests upon the way that urban design is taught. Architecture typically focuses on form and spatial aesthetics, often at the building or block scale, but rarely relating these to the city as a whole. Planning, by contrast, emphasises regulations, policy frameworks, and procedural norms. Landscape architecture offers a promising model of survey and process, but emphasises ecological and aesthetic biases in green infrastructure. None of these approaches on its own fully captures the multi-scalar, multidisciplinary nature of urban design. The result is a set of fragmented pedagogical models. Urban design is frequently taught as a standalone course, siloed within architecture, landscape architecture, or planning programs. Graduates emerge with strong training in one lens, but a limited grasp of the interconnected environmental, social, cultural, and economic dimensions that shape urban places. This fragmentation intensifies the original problem. Urban design remains a contested field, shared but never fully owned or understood by competing disciplines. Urban design deals with what Riesel and Weber called wicked problems, issues that are complex, contested, and without clear solutions. Think of climate change, inequality and housing affordability, public health, mobility, and the politics of public space. None of these can be resolved by one discipline alone. So if urban design is about working with wicked problems, then our teaching needs to reflect that complexity and the multiplicity of perspectives required. Urban design is by its very nature a complex web of disciplines, each with its own theories and practices, and the question must be asked, what is the most appropriate way to teach it? What are the pedagogical best practices? One reason ownership is so contested is that urban design itself has been hard to define. For a long time, it was described as simply the overlap between architecture, landscape architecture, and planning. Helpful, but also vague. There is no single agreed canon or stable body of knowledge. The boundaries with other fields are fluid. Urban design grapples with its multifaceted definitions, roles, territories, naming, and pedagogies, and that ambiguity filters directly into how we design curricula and studios. In the words of the distinguished architect and educator Patrick Nuches, until you have the name for a thing, you have very little knowledge of it. Search and others have invited us to think differently. Rather than seeing urban design as just the intersection of three disciplines, they propose it is more an integrated design practice in its own right. This reframing suggests that urban design should be a first-order design discipline with its own core concerns and methods, rather than a secondary space defined by others. But if we take this seriously, we also need to rethink the pedagogical structures that support it. At UNSW, in our own pedagogy, this framework is extended by explicitly including heritage. Following arguments by Rem Koolhaas and many others, heritage today is not a marginal concern. It's a dominant force shaping contemporary cities. It mediates what can change, what must remain, and whose histories are visible. So, urban design and education must integrate heritage as a central dimension, not as an add-on elective. This has major implications for how we shape our studios and curricula. We often hear the terms multi, inter, and transdisciplinary used interchangeably, but they are not the same. Multidisciplinary approaches place different disciplines side by side. Each discipline contributes but largely retains its own methods and boundaries. Interdisciplinary approaches encourage some integration between disciplines, but they may still be framed around a dominant field. Transdisciplinary practice goes further. It invites us to step beyond disciplinary boundaries altogether, co-creating new ways of seeing, asking, and acting. It brings in not only academic experience, but also the lived experience of communities, stakeholders, and non-traditional voices. In the urban design studio, this means that the object of the study, the city, is not owned by any one discipline, but is shared, negotiated, and reimagined collectively. In this presentation, we argue that transdisciplinary curricula are not an optional enhancement to the urban design studio. They are central to its relevance and effectiveness. By placing transdisciplinary at the core of the curriculum, we expose students to multiple epistemologies and value systems, encourage them to move fluidly between scales, from the intimate to the metropolitan, equip them to navigate contested and uncertain urban futures. This is not simply about adding more content. It is about restructuring how learning is framed, how projects are framed, and how the studio operates as a collective learning environment. Traditionally, certain disciplines have claimed ownership over aspects of the city. Planners own regulation and policy, architects own form and space, engineers own infrastructure, and so on. In a transdisciplinary urban design studio, this ownership is intentionally unsettled. Students are encouraged to question who gets to define urban problems, challenge whose knowledge is considered legitimate, share authorship across disciplines, roles, and perspectives. This does not erase disciplinary expertise. Instead, it treats expertise as one voice in a broader conversation, rather than the only voice that matters. When transdisciplinarity becomes central, pedagogy itself must shift. The studio moves away from the behaviourist teacher as expert model towards a constructivist, facilitator, or co-learner model. Educators curate conditions for learning, bring in diverse voices, and model collaboration across differences. Key pedagogical shifts include designing open-ended, complex briefs that cannot be solved by a single disciplinary vantage point, emphasizing process over product with reflective practice and critical dialogue as core outcomes, encouraging students to negotiate roles, responsibilities, and authorship in teams. In this way, the studio becomes a rehearsal space for the kinds of collaborative, uncertain, and contested environments students will encounter in professional practice. To embed transdisciplinarity structurally, we reconsider how the curriculum can be staged and how the studio is organised. This may include co-teaching arrangements across different disciplines and faculties, shared modules, workshops, or intensives that bring together students from various programs, assessment frameworks that reward collaboration, negotiation, and critical reflection, not only individual technical skill. The Urban Design Studio serves as a hub connecting these various learning experiences, rather than a standalone subject. In our own studios, transdisciplinary practice is built into how we design learning. We use John Biggs' constructive alignment to map curricula so that outcomes, activities, and assessments are clearly aligned and scaffolded. We draw on Thies and van der Rijke's curriculum design model to involve communities and stakeholders in participatory, context-sensitive curriculum design. Our projects are informed by Dutton's project-based learning, using real-world problems and speculative scenarios to explore alternative urban futures. And we integrate Donald Schoen's reflective practice through reflective writing, peer critique, and dialogic seminars, so students examine not only what they design, but also how and for whom they design. Together, these and many other learning, teaching, and curricular theories shape our urban design studios and help students understand both the city and their own agency within it. We want to ground this presentation in two brief examples of transdisciplinary urban design studio in practice in the Master of Urban Development and Design at the University of New South Wales. The first is the 2019 North Sydney studio. Here, instead of just accepting the state government's over-metro office development as a given, students were asked to rethink North Sydney as a whole. They treated the metro as a catalyst site for broader urban transformation. We brought together mixed teams from architecture planning, landscape architecture, engineering, design, and the social sciences, and worked closely with council community organisations and cultural groups. The course began with shared mapping. Students layered infrastructure, demographics, histories, and local stories to reveal patterns of exclusion, underused spaces, and new opportunities. Their final projects didn't stop at form. They combined spatial proposals and ideas for governance, stewardship, and community participation, showing how a studio can engage with power, values, and long-term management, not just with shape and style. The second example zooms out to the international studios, which ran as a mandatory component from 2005 to 2020 across more than 53 cities. Before travelling, students researched each context, its governance, heritage, climate, and regulatory environment. They then spent 2 intensive weeks in the city, working in mixed teams with local universities and practices. These studios tackled housing, climate adaptation, mobility, and the adaptive reuse of existing and heritage fabric. Proposals were phased and transdisciplinary, and were refined back in Sydney to connect international lessons to local practice. Together, the North Sydney and international studios show that urban design education is not only transdisciplinary, but it is also fundamentally transnational, and that immersive studio formats are uniquely powerful for preparing students to work in complex, contested urban environments. What emerged from this type of studio was not only a different kind of project, but also a new way of understanding professional identity. Students reported that they developed a more nuanced understanding of their discipline, gaining clarity on its strengths and limitations. They gained confidence in collaborating across disciplines and engaging with non-academic partners. They became more comfortable with uncertainty and disagreement, recognizing these as inherent aspects of real-world urban change. Importantly, many students began to see themselves less as isolated experts who provide solutions and more as facilitators, advocates, and collaborators within broader networks of actors in the city. We argue that these shifts in self-understanding are among the most significant outcomes of a transdisciplinary curriculum. During the COVID-19 pandemic, many universities used the crisis as a pretext to eliminate costly programs and faculty positions. Unfortunately, the MUD program was one of those cut during this period, along with many other internationally acclaimed programs. It is important to acknowledge that this approach is not simple or straightforward to implement. There are real institutional challenges. Timetables, credit structures, accreditation requirements, and funding models are often organised around clear disciplinary lines. There are pedagogical tensions balancing openness with structure, experimentation with accountability, and collaboration with the need to assess individual learning. There are also workload implications. Co-teaching, community engagement, and complex assessment can require more time, coordination, and emotional labour from staff. If we do not explicitly name and negotiate these challenges, transdisciplinary risks becoming tokenistic, an attractive term that does not fundamentally change how the studio operates. Part of the work, then, is to develop institutional frameworks and cultures that support teachers in taking risks and that recognise the value of this kind of teaching. Furthermore, we acknowledge that the studio teaching method is not formally adopted by some disciplines, especially planning, as a core part of their pedagogical approach. This creates further tensions when the teaching of urban design is relegated to a subject within an existing discipline rather than a standalone degree in its own right. For educators, embracing a transdisciplinary urban design studio involves several commitments: a willingness to share authority over briefs, assessment, and even the framing of what counts as a successful project, an openness to ongoing dialogue and negotiation with colleagues from other disciplines and with partners outside the university, a readiness to reflect critically on our own assumptions, including how our disciplinary training shapes what we see as possible or important. For institutions, there are broader implications: rethinking program structures so that cross-disciplinary collaboration is not always an exception or an extra, but an expected part of the curriculum, creating mechanisms for recognising and rewarding collaborative teaching and community-engaged work, supporting the infrastructural needs of this approach, whether that is flexible studio spaces, shared budgets, or more adaptable timetabling. In this sense, the urban design studio becomes a lens through which we can rethink the university's role in relation to urban futures more generally. To bring these threads together, we want to return to the central proposition of this presentation. The urban design studio is more than a space where disciplinary knowledge is applied. It is a space where knowledge is contested, shared, and remade in response to the complex realities of urban life. By placing transdisciplinary curricula at its core, we challenge traditional notions of who owns a city as an object of design and planning, reconfigure pedagogy to foreground collaboration, reflexivity, and engagement with multiple publics, equip students to participate in shaping cities in ways that are more just, more sustainable, and more attuned to diverse forms of knowledge. Transdisciplinarity in this view is not an optional enhancement. It is a necessary response to the kinds of urban challenges our graduates will inherit. In closing, 3 points. First, transdisciplinary urban design studio are both an intellectual and ethical commitment. They reshape what we count as knowledge, whose voices we centre, and how we prepare students for contested cities. Second, this work is collective. It relies on cross-disciplinary collaboration and real partnerships with communities and institutions. Finally, treat the studio not only as a place for designing cities, but as a space for redesigning curricula, disciplines, and pedagogies. Here are some references that informed our presentation. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your questions and discussion.